Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 6 of the Courage to Thrive show, starring our favorite Reverend Dr. Robert Flanagan here in Northern Virginia. Today, he is going to have a fascinating conversation with Lauren Breeden. Their topic, tackling sexual trafficking. I can't wait to hear this. It's already hurting my heart. My name is Hope Katz-Gibbs. I am the proud producer of the show on Incandescent Radio, Incandescent TV, and then we are also blasted out on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. So let me tell you a little bit about our guest before Bob takes over. Lauren serves as Director of Formation and Families and is part of the Falls Church Episcopal's senior leadership team here in Northern Virginia. She's known for innovation, formation, curriculum writing, and developing holistic programs that equip people of all ages to engage deeply in the exploration of faith. Before entering church leadership, Lauren spent 12 years combating domestic minor sex trafficking as an investigator, including undercover work, amazing, and as an educator and advocate for survivors. Today, she brings that experience into her ministry and public work, helping churches and communities better understand trafficking, support survivors, and respond to exploitation with courage and justice. How beautiful. Thank you for your work, Lauren. All right, Bob, take it away.
All right, thanks, Hope. Thanks as always for access to the platform and all your help. I'm really appreciative. And welcome, Lauren. Thanks for being with us and coming on the show. So I'm thrilled to have you with us. I've known you for a few years now, and in a recent conversation, heard a little bit more about your previous work and thought, wow, what a wonderful guest that you would make for everybody that listens to this show, and to get the word out on what's something that's so important to you. So why don't we start, with a bit of a hello and a bit of a description of your spiritual journey, as I'd like to do with everybody that comes on. So take it away. Yeah.
Hello, I'm so grateful for being here. Thanks for having me on. When I was wondering about the question about my spiritual journey, I definitely think it has been one where God and I have always been a team, but I have navigated struggling with God's followers throughout my spiritual journey in the organization of the church. I grew up in an Episcopal church that actually felt far more fundamental and evangelical than what we know of our denomination now. I grew up in the Falls Church as a child before the split, which was a really formative invitation to a different lens of looking at faith. I, as an adult, got to vote in the split and sided with the Episcopal Church. I am now a proud Episcopalian, and now God has called me back into that building to work with children, and youth and adults, which has been what a resurrection journey for me. And so my spiritual faith was really grounded in always questioning scripture, always wondering and exploring, but not being safe to do so as a child. In the place that I grew up, questioning wasn't something that was encouraged. And so now that I get to run formation programs in that space and encourage questioning and critical thinking, it's just been such a spiritual resurrection for me. And I've just fallen deeply in love with the Episcopal Church and how we are a people that invite critical thinking and questioning and wonder about things like justice and equity, and can have conversations like the one we're having today. So I'd say my faith is really rooted in exploration and wonder, and guided by that.
Cool. So let's pause at the split. So some of our folks may not, whether they're Episcopalian or not Episcopalian, know what we're talking about with the split, and what the split we're talking about is what happened in the early 2000s with the election and consecration of the New Hampshire Bishop Gene Robinson, who was openly gay and partnered, and the impact of that had not just in the U.S. but the wider Episcopal Church. And the fallout is become that there are the split formed two churches, the Episcopal Church and then the Anglican Church in North America, which is as we would say, more. I'll let you help me inform that. But the principles of the split were around human sexuality, were around in some of their language, recalling from back in the day, so I may not have it fully formed, but their language was that the Episcopal Church had was too closely tied to culture and the movements of culture, and and not tied closely enough to biblical understanding. Well, in the intervening 20 years, there have been a variety of people that have done work. In particular, I want to point people to Matthew Vines, who is not an Episcopalian, but was a young man at Harvard who came out of a church in Kansas and just kind of discovered his or embraced his human sexuality as a gay man. And he did a fabulous work in exploring his own faith and how he could be gay and a Christian. And I think he started a number of people diving into kind of our understanding of biblical interpretation of the half a dozen or so Bible verses that tend to be pointed at for that stand against homosexuality and divergence of what we might say, the heterosexuality point of view, and then the Episcopal Church, for better or worse, or at least as a priest in the Episcopal Church, I'll speak from my point of view, is that I think the ACNA, while maybe biblical, no really more biblical than we are, certainly in practice. And though I would imagine some of the ACNA folks would disagree with us, but I also would say is that they are fervently anti-homosexual and to a point where I think they are not in step with contemporary biblical understanding, nor in step with just the average, not even, we call it mainstream, but the average interpretation or understanding of homosexuality in the U.S. So that's kind of my nutshell background. But how would you want to add to that if I've any clarifications?
Yeah, I think when I was growing up, that was very clearly the stance, and there was very little nuance. And there was no desire to have nuance, right? And so that was the stance, and which is a fairly, from my understanding, evangelical viewpoint, right? So that they're very based on a more, at the time, literal interpretation of Scripture. I do think they are a little bit different now. And again, it depends on what ACNA church you attend, right? So I think as a whole, though, their denomination does not, they still believe in marriage is only between a man and the woman, and that is the sanctity of marriage. And so, I do believe now that they believe if you are any form of gay, lesbian, it is okay as long as you remain celibate, which is a really, in my opinion, terrible lens, but they think is a more progressive standpoint. I would also say intertied to this, especially when I was growing up, is a deep purity culture. Especially for women, although it did definitely impact men as well. And within that, there is a lot of rules and standards of how you were supposed to dress, how you were supposed to date. When I was growing up, kissing, dating goodbye was a huge movement within my church, which the author has since apologized for that book. And so, and how deeply it impacted and hurt people. But I think their purity culture lens, while it's more progressive now, is still much more undercoated and still there than it would be as it explored in some other denominations. So there still is a lot of stint on a very rigid sexual ethics overall, not even within the lens of LGBTQ plus AI, right? Like they are still very like have a rigid sexual ethics for everything. And as a result, while there's more nuance now than I was growing up in the early the 90s and 2000s, it is not nuanced enough where they're having deep conversations around who and why there's inclusivity in scripture. I would not say that they would look at it, especially from a sexual lens like that.
Okay.
So,
Yeah. So two things. One is, I mean, I'll state my own opinion here because I feel pretty strongly about it, is that I think the allowance of homosexuality, certainly, and not really, I haven't spent more than 5 minutes thinking about beyond homosexuality in terms of um, uh, the additional types of gender and understanding of that. But I would say certainly for the societal benefit of having people partnered in long-term relationships, and then certainly people in long-term relationships, no matter their sexual orientation and their willingness to come to a Christian to come into Christianity is certainly a societal benefit in large ways. I think that helps ground society in further positive sense. So that's my opinion of where I fall into this is certainly, that stance on marriage is a benefit to humanity as a whole, and so that's my opinion. So for those that are interested in kind of understanding the depths of purity culture and kind of maybe hearing this for the first time, if you're just kind of a Christian, or Episcopalian progressive person hearing like, what is this purity culture thing? Two things. I would on social media track with Jubilee Dawns and her podcast Healedish, which she came out of a very strong purity culture and kind of feels that it's taken a strong stance against it in many ways, and how it affected her, and she does a lot of interviewing of people where those that have been strongly affected by it. But essentially, and again, help inform me here. Purity culture, it was a late 90s, early 2000s kind of movement in the church that said, hey, young people, you're going to remain pure as you're growing up and interacting with people of the opposite sex, or in sexualized relationships, and that kind of dating and things all around kind of, I will be pure until, or I will be sex free, if we want to call it. I will abstain from sexual activity before I am married, and I'm going to follow a prescribed set of rules. That those undercurrents were, very stifling and ultimately very harmful. So is that your understanding of purity culture? Did I get it right?
Yeah, I think that's a good synopsis. I think some of the key takeaways for purity culture as a whole is lack of sexual education often is a byproduct of purity culture, because you will not be having sex before marriage. There's no reason to teach you anything but abstinence education, which we've seen is statistically and scientifically proven not to work if it is only taught as abstinence instead of taught as an option within sexual education. And so I was blessed with parents that taught me more than that, but the actual culture of the day was that you do not talk about any form of sex topics with your children, because they should not be thinking about it, because thinking about it in purity culture is still a sin, right? So even talking about sexual safety and consent, or definitely not pleasure of any kind, was not something that was on the table. And as a result, which leads into later into our conversation, there wasn't a lot of transparency around sex or your own bodies. And you didn't have the ability to articulate if someone was abusing you because you didn't understand your own body and what was happening to you at the time. And so I always say that the best way to combat abuse is transparency in education as a whole, right? And so if you're going to take that education away from children and youth, and also put a huge emphasis on shame, which I think is the other really big component of purity culture. It's not just like if you mess up, you have to like repent. There is a serious shame element to it. Like there are people that grew up with lessons, for example, where they would teach women, which I remember this lesson, that they would chew a piece of gum and then ask somebody if they would want that chewed piece of gum. And they would say, no, that's disgusting. And they said, things like having sex before marriage makes you a chewed piece of gum for your future husband. So like this idea of like you are ruined as an individual, especially for women, far more emphasis on sexual purity for women if you had sex before marriage, or even if you explored like your own sexual pleasure before marriage, like, and that all of that was supposed to be just in the confines of marriage. So the emphasis on purity culture is not just like you're going to wait until marriage and abstain. It is you're going to do nothing until marriage and abstain. And you can't even understand your own body's pleasure before marriage. And if you do anything of those regards, like you are a chewed piece of gum. Now, each church did that in different varying levels, but that is like the emphasis of purity culture ideology as a whole, right? Especially for women, you're not supposed to do anything. And also within the purity culture as a whole, again, not necessarily taught in the church that I grew up, but is that your body belongs to your future spouse. You don't have this idea of consent within purity culture as, you know, other sexual ethics present you, because you are made for, they use, in my opinion, they poorly exegete scripture on submitting to your husband, your entire body. And so you don't have the ability to consent in a marriage. Again, not necessarily taught where I grew up, but as a purity culture ideology as a whole, that is something. So I would say the three main points are lack of consent, lack of education, and this deep sense of shame that you are ruined if you do anything sexually before being married.
So where are, let's just to help folks, is that that's really a Pauline understanding of sexuality, that meaning it comes out, and if my memory is serving me right now, it's in the letters of Timothy. Is that correct? And so that's again, we're in some ways as Episcopalians, we hesitate to interpret scripture in the narrow. That we like to interpret scripture broadly. So we can't just say, okay, we're going to hang all of our actions on one or two lines that Paul wrote to for guidance to one of his followers. Is that, yeah.
Yeah, it's a much more narrow interpretation of scripture, and it's not necessarily taking into account the original text it was written in, the language, the context, who it was written for, right? So a lot of this is pulled from letters, and then like exegeted in a narrow lens that it means it applies, every part of it applies to everyone, right? And so I think anytime you exegete scripture like that, it's really easy to say that this is only one way of doing something versus like a broader understanding of a conversation. So.
Right. Exactly. Okay, great. And so is this, was this kind of your reaction to this, and your choosing to stay with the Episcopal Church, and that voting, a very Episcopal thing to do, the voting of how we're going to be church and the local parish and where we want to go and land. So during that split time, is your reaction to purity culture kind of what informs you to go into work on behalf of minors, or is it? Tell me about that, because it's an interesting move that you make. I mean, not very many people will have the passion or calling to go into, the protection of minors and sex trafficking. You're entering into dangerous land, presumably.
Yeah, so I think to summarize kind of a long story there, within purity culture, I saw a lot of abuse happening because when you don't have transparency and when people are not given an equipped understanding of their own bodies, abuse is rampant. And so I personally experienced some of that abuse and watched some of my fellow friends experience abuse within purity culture. And as a result, from a very young age, really wanted to become an advocate for abuse survivors
Mm-hmm.
and to advocate for a different understanding and inclusivity of a sexual conversation that included equipping information and really asking for transparency within organizations, whether religious or nonprofits or the corporate or political world. It was really important to me that there was education around being transparent and protecting everyone, but especially children as a vulnerable population. And so the first thing I did was enter into that type of work and work with organizations that fought child abuse. But within that nonprofit setting, I saw a lot of sex trafficking because a lot of abuse is very interconnected. And so I saw domestic violence as well. And so my personality is I want to approach things holistically. I understand that we can't approach things as a singular topic, that there's a lot of nuance. And so I want to learn about what's happening even around the particular topic that I am currently involved in. And so I went to a survivor-informed training on sex trafficking to learn a little bit more so I could advocate better for the children I was working with. And another thing about me is I want to find the survivors that are doing the work. I want to learn from a trauma survivor-centered, informed place. And so I went to this training led by Courtney's House, which is founded by Tina Front, who was trafficked for over 22 years in the DMV area and started her own organization to help people who were survivors of trafficking and also provide education to stop trafficking as a whole in the United States. And as soon as I came out of that training, I remember walking up to her and being like, I want to work here. And she said, we have 3 employees and very little funding, so we're probably not going to have a job for you. And I said, well, within a year, I want to work here. And so within that year, worked as a volunteer for her and then helped her fundraise. And then at the end of that year, I was offered director of investigation role in her organization. Wow. So and that's kind of how I got into it in my very early 20s. So
okay. Wow. Okay. So just for clarification, when we use like DMV, a lot of people are thinking long lines at the getting licenses in most of America. Around here, we refer to DMV as the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia. And so I think I'm certainly surprised. I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that, in one of the major cities of the U.S., the capital area of the U.S., we had a person who was sex trafficked for 20 years. And so there's, kind of that is a surprise. I want to hear more about that for a second. And then, you're 22 years old and you're saying, hey, I'm going to be, I'm coming in and I want to help the organization, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that. So give us a little bit. Is it Tina is the person? And then tell us a little bit more about that turn is very courageous and passionate.
Yeah, so Tina Front is a remarkable person. I invite everybody to follow her organization called Courtney's House. She's doing some incredible work. She was on the sex trafficking task force under Obama in the presidential advisory group. And so she is really on the forefront of doing a lot of this work. And I was really honored to get to listen to her story and how she is combating. And so as a young person, I saw in her someone that was trauma-informed, survivor-informed, and was on the ground doing the work. And that was something that really called to me as someone who really appreciates that form of transparency, that form of trauma-informed work. I'd seen a lot of other nonprofits do things differently and not necessarily hold that space, which non-trauma informed survivor center work can often be really damaging. And so I really fell in love with her methodology. And as a result, I started volunteering with her. And that's one thing I would encourage everybody. If there is something that you're really interested in learning more about and getting involved, go to a training, start volunteering, right? Because most nonprofit organizations need volunteers desperately. And so that was something I knew was a definite need. And so I started volunteering with her with an outreach group. So the outreach team at the time would be a group, and I can give like a small lens on it, but a lot of it's in secrecy. So I don't want to, but the outreach group at the time when I was doing it were people who were on the ground walking, where children and adults were being trafficked in DC, Virginia, and Maryland, and offering them something that they could have that would not be clear that it was a hotline number, but had a hotline number on it. And so I started volunteering with that group and fell in love with that work. And as a result, started going with her to do some training. So I became a volunteer instructor for that particular ministry of hers. And that kind of led me into helping with her an instructor of law enforcement, because that was a huge part of what Courtney House does. Is it works with local and federal law enforcement to train them on a survivor trauma-informed perspective on human trafficking, especially in the United States, because in the early and mid 2000s, we're still really grasping with this is a problem in the U.S. and how do we do it from a trauma-informed way.
Yeah.
And so she was really on the forefront of inviting them to look at things differently. Typically how they would run raids in the past would be very like drug-centered way of methodology of doing things, which doesn't work that well with human trafficking. And so she was inviting them into a different lens. And so I ended up going with her as a volunteer to do a lot of those educations. And it just became clear through that volunteering that this was something that both of us worked really well on doing and that she was willing to mentor me into. And so she brought me in when they had the finances to do it as a full-time role, which I feel very blessed to be able to be under her guidance at the time, and really learned from her, and then slowly began doing my own education within the Courtney's House lens, but out there within law enforcement and local and first responders and religious leaders. So people who would come in contact with victims and maybe even buyers and perpetrators, and how do we faithfully respond in a way that serves justice would be the lens in which I would be teaching in.
Wow. Okay. So, all right. So here you are. You're volunteering with an important agency, not-for-profit. You're helping, training law enforcement and others to be aware of the sexual abuse survivor, the sex traffic survivor situation. And yet that's not enough in some ways, right? Because you then go undercover. And so what's that like? That sounds really super scary and yet probably really exhilarating and probably very rewarding, but also could lead very much to burnout and all of that kind of stuff. So give us, how did you get into it? And then what was your first undercover work, if you can? If you can say this to us and let us know about this stuff. But you give us some perspective on that. That's, what would presumably you were in the U.S., you were domestic. So what does all that look like?
Yeah, so I only did domestic sex trafficking of minor work. Like I only combated that. Every once in a while, I would interact with international victims, and we would refer them to people who are doing that specialized work. So our specialization was domestic minor sex trafficking. So children from the US trafficked within the US. And so a lot of our undercover work was investigative in the sense that we were working either with law enforcement, helping them, or we were working with news outlets, helping them expose a story. So those are two of like the big ones I would do on the ground, but I was also deeply online because this is also very interconnected to the online space. And on the online space, which I have a little bit more ability to talk about, I would be either presenting as a victim or potential victim, as a buyer, or even as a trafficker. And sometimes we would help law enforcement find whoever they were looking for in those three categories by using our online presence, because there's an entire language in this world. There's an entire culture, an entire language that's very methodical and well thought out. Having someone who is a boss who was a survivor, who intimately knew this language, we were able to be on a presence online in a different way than a lot of people were at the time. There's been since training, and they're doing a much better job within that now. But at the time, this was still very nuanced and new. And so we were able to go on using key language that she knew of, that would really get us into these upper level chat rooms at the time, or these black market places that you wouldn't be able to be in if you didn't know the right language and the things to say, or you'd be easily identified by slipping up and using the wrong language. They wouldn't let you into some of these inner places. And so a lot of the work I did was get to very dark places on the web. Now, obviously, law enforcement knew we were doing this. This is not something you can just do on a computer. That will absolutely get you arrested. So like this was under the guise of law enforcement understood what we were doing at the time, and we were working in conjunction with them. And so this wasn't like a rogue organization doing rogue work. We were deeply working with both federal and local law enforcement, and they were aware that we were presenting like this. But as a result, we were able to help them find victims. We were able to help them find traffickers. I do remember there was one time we were doing a training out of state. We worked out of state as well. We worked with Iowa, New York, and some other states. So in one of the states we were in, we were doing a training for federal law enforcement. And I was on the search engine I was using at the time, which was a social media, having a conversation with a trafficker in the area. And I asked them, where do you want me to send him? And they said a hotel. And we knew that if we send a trafficker to a particular location, that they would also bring the children they were trafficking with if we did it in the right way and use the correct language. And so we were able to do that. And they were able to rescue 12 minors that day through that conversation. So it was a really impactful thing to teach them the language and the methodology and the culture within this organization. I think one of the things that really does a disservice is a lot of people look at traffickers like thugs, and instead of organized crime, and it is organized crime. Like there are rules, there are levels, there's a huge organized structure to this. Now, there are lower levels that are more like independence, but as a whole, this is organized crime. So teaching people, what did organized crime look like? What is the organization? What are the terminologies in the organization? What are the cultural liturgies of the organization in the sense of what are their traditions was really impactful to helping law enforcement be able to get into this intersanctum and get higher level people, or have them come with their they call it a stable. It's a terrible thing to say, but they call the children and adults that they are trafficking their stable. And so would bring all of that with them when they were doing a sting operation. So it was both like undercover in person and also online during that time period.
Wow. Okay. And so this makes me pause and think, okay, how does a child, a young person, or just an individual, kind of protect themselves, somebody who's vulnerable that fits, the profile of or just could be picked up and trafficked, how can an individual face off against an organization? Organized crime is not, now it's not just, it's bad enough if it's one-on-one, one predator, one, one sick individual, evil individual. But you're talking about a system, a group that has structure, and structure means people can kind of be brought in and out of the structure. I mean, what would you recommend? I mean, if a mom or dad is listening to this, or a young person's listening to this, what would you offer as protection? What to do? How do you protect your kids from this? How do you protect yourself from this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the three things I always say is, one, educate your kids about their bodies. Talk about what they're called. Don't use like code words for body parts. Use actual names for body parts so that the kids understand their own bodies, and so they can communicate with you too if someone is doing something to them that makes them uncomfortable or is unsafe. Because this doesn't happen overnight. I think that people think of things like the movie Taken, and they're like, that's what trafficking looks like. And while that can happen, it's insanely rare to have strangers come in the middle of the night or like during the day and pull you from a hotel. So what more often happens is what's called grooming. And that's where somebody becomes integrated into the life of a person or a child, right? And slowly over time grooms them to be more susceptible to abusive behavior. It's a really insidious methodology. It also really integrates victimology within it too, because, for example, one way this can look is like it's a coach that is working with your child and says that they will tutor your child for them at their house, right? Like, and so you've now had the child isolated with another adult that is perceived as trusted. And what they often do is will create a sense of secrecy with a child. Like, for example, your parents say an 8-year-old shouldn't have an iPhone because an 8-year-old shouldn't have an iPhone, right? And so but that person will be like, well, I'll buy you an iPhone and you can keep it in my office. So what that does is it not only isolates that child coming into that office every time they want to use their iPhone, it also creates this victimology in the sense that the child knew the parents weren't allowing them to have an iPhone. So if something then happens to them in a child's brain, they're both afraid of getting in trouble for the iPhone and for what happened to them. And they can start to be like, this is my fault because my parents told me not to have this iPhone. And usually the groomer will play on that. Like, well, you weren't supposed to have this iPhone anyway, so you did this to yourself. And so within that, there is that shame that's happening. So I'd say definitely teach your kids about their body parts. Teach them that they can come to you with anything, especially that there's like safety within that conversation. So if your teenager like goes out to a party, that they can come and tell you safely, even if they broke a rule, if something happens to them at that party, right? Because that's another big way of doing it is like groomers will throw parties for teenagers and they knew they weren't supposed to be there, and then they have something happen to them and then they're afraid to tell their parents because they weren't supposed to be there. So create that sense of safety, teach them about their body parts. Also, I, again, believe in transparency. So if you have trusted adults around your children, like get to know the people that are with your children, like get to know them well, understand who they are, whether they're teachers, coaches, religious leaders. Don't assume because someone's in a position of authority, they're safe. I mean, don't assume everyone's unsafe, but don't like go into things blinders. Get to know the people that your kids are interacting with and talking to. And then I'd say finally, that goes for online too. I always tell parents that an online space is like sending your kid to the most dangerous neighborhood in the world. Don't send them there alone.
Yeah.
Equip them with language, with protections, with boundaries, huge ways that traffickers get to know kids to start grooming them is on social media. So if you look at the 2023 human trafficking report that was sent out by the Federal Bureaus of Investigation, one of the biggest ways a trafficker is connected with victims was Snapchat.
Okay.
So like they're using social media to connect with kids, like Instagram and Facebook were the other two really big ones. So understand, especially when your children are little, who they're interacting with on social media as well. Make sure that there's transparency within that. Social media, I think, came out so quickly that we didn't always have the ability to understand boundaries within it. I mean, some countries are not allowing children or teens on social media at all for other reasons. But I would also say if you are, like, just be there with them. So teach them about their bodies, create a safe place for them to talk to, get to know the people that are around them. And that includes on social media.
Yeah. So, so Snapchat, right, for people younger than me, is that's been around for a while. That's not a new. That's not very new as a platform. So and most people, or at least my age and older, won't understand that the understanding of Snapchat is that the conversations disappear afterwards. There's not a retaining of the information, that it goes away immediately. So that a private conversation is private in that the parents aren't going to be able to kind of look at a history of that. So even now, Snapchat is a problematic, you think, and any other type of software program like that is problematic. Are there other? I mean, I don't want to, and I don't want to just pick on Snapchat. I mean, are there other types of or other platforms that are the same, have that same?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Anyone that you could think of. I mean, when I was doing it, it's not as big of a social media network now, but I actually busted a case that was being groomed on Pinterest. So like they're
Yeah.
which you would never think, right? And so I'd say any form of social media, whether it's TikTok or whether it's Lemon or some of the newer ones that are coming out, parents should be highly involved in when children and teenagers are on social media, and not in the sense of like, you're not teaching them how to do it for themselves, because that's the other thing that I see that I encourage parents not to do. Be involved, but teach them the language and boundaries so they can protect themselves, so that when they're getting out into these higher level teenage years and they're leaving the home where you can't be as active, they're not just completely left out, right, to the wolves, really, that you are working with them to get them to a place that they can safely be on social media by themselves, right? You don't want to release them into the world and they don't know what they're doing because you've been so restrictive with it. So I'm not saying that you should be with them holding their hands all the time, but start by being there. And just like in any form of parenting, equip them and empower them so that they can then leave the nest having that ability to understand social media.
Wow. Okay. Let's transition, in your journey, you did this for 12 years, and then the church, you brought yourself back into the church and eventually into seminary. So how did that transition happen, and what brought you there?
Yeah, so two things. One, within my work, I saw the impact religious leaders had on people who, A, were victims and would come and ask for help within those organizations, or also I saw the insidious side of it, right? Like I saw when there were religious leaders who were buyers or who were coming in and really proponing trafficking. So because I worked in the Northern Virginia, DC, Maryland area on tracks that where children and adults are openly sold for sex on the street, I saw sometimes they were sold for sex on the steps of churches, whether the churches knew about it or not. Like sometimes they didn't, other times that they did and didn't seem to care. It was like we don't see that type of personality. Other times they were involved. Like I saw religious leaders buy children for sex with collars on, right? And so it was really so I had to really wrestle with faith as a whole at that time. And so God and I had a lot of conversations, which you would not think would lead me back to an organized religion.
Right.
Right. But God and I really had a lot of conversations about God's followers, including myself, and being like, wow, like this is a really hard space for me to navigate. And within that time period, my dad got sick with cancer and passed away. And I got to see this other side of organized religion come up, where communities of people of faith really walked alongside me. And my friends who were believers really walked alongside me during that time, because I was in my early to mid 20s. That is not a time you expect to lose a parent, nor is it a time you feel equipped to lose a parent. I did not have a partner with me at that time. A lot of my friends had never lost parents. So dealing with grief and lamentation was not something we really understood. But a few key people in my life that were, one was a priest and others were like really high-level ministry leaders of a local Episcopal church, really walked alongside my entire family during that time period. And so while I was simultaneously seeing a really insidious side of organized religion, I was also seeing a really beautiful invitational side of organized religion. And within that year of grief, I really began to see the benefits of doing things in community. And I really felt like God was calling me back to go more regularly into the church. And so I started, like I always do, volunteering, right? One of the things I always love doing is working with kids. So I started volunteering with children's ministry programs in the area and working with them. And I'd already had some connections to that because I did a lot of education for like exactly what you were asking before, what do parents do? And so like I'd already had some connections. So I started going back to church and working with kids in the ministry programs there. And God very clearly, I remember one night, was like, this is where I'm calling you to be. And I went, no, thank you. As most people, when God is calling them, I was like, no, thank you. That sounds terrible. I don't want to work for the church. And then God just kept calling and tugging. It was very much like Jonah, where I was like running away. I was like, no, thank you. This is not for me. And over that running away time period, God really wrestled with me and like very viscerally wrestled with me. I really understand the Jacob story of wrestling with God. And I really did hear God calling me back to the church. And I said, okay, well, I will do that part-time while I work on trafficking full-time. So at one point I was doing part-time ministry work and full-time anti-trafficking work. And God was like, okay, but I'm calling you back into the church. And slowly over time, I don't want to say God wore me down, but God like really made it clear that this is where I was supposed to go. And so I followed and was like, okay, I'll give it a chance. And I applied for a job that I was like, if God gives me this job, I will go into that while simultaneously applying for a big anti-trafficking job. I was like, okay, God, make it very clear where you want me to be. And I was offered both. And I went, God, I said clarity, like that's really hard. And but then through, praying, it became really abundantly obvious which one I needed to take. And so I was called back into the church. And so I took on a full-time children's ministry director role at the time, obviously one that was very, very into child safety. And so, and then that kind of became that journey of where I was taking both my past experience and my current calling and intertwining them together. I deeply believe God wastes nothing. And over the last couple years, I have been able to create spaces for children and families and youth and adults that felt safe, that felt empowering, that really honored critical thinking and awareness, and were really centered on justice and child safety. And so God kind of brought all of this together to create this liberative theology that reigns in all the places that I've been really grateful to work in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And seminary's been a piece of that, and studying at Virginia Seminary has been really. How has that played in for you, and what would you say about that?
Yeah, so I think you're going to see a theme in my story that God kind of like hits me over the head with things. It's not as much as like a subtlety thing. I need like a
Yeah.
full blonde booming voice of like, hey. So I was meeting with Dr. Lisa Kimball, who is a professor at VTS Seminary, about a grant that the Falls Church, where I work, had been awarded through the Lillian Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was going through lifelong learning. So I was sitting at VT, asked us to come to VTS to have her because it's a great place to meet with people. And so we sat there and I had lunch with her to talk about this grant. And to back up a little bit, I used to live in Fairlington and would run through the campus a lot. And I always felt very at home there. And I did not know why. I was like, this feels like a place I should be. But I didn't understand at that moment what that meant. So coming to VTS to meet with her, I felt that sense of like home again, right? Where I was like, this is where I should be, but no understanding of why I felt that way. And so after having this conversation with Lisa about the grant, I still didn't kind of understand what the grant was doing because sometimes Lillian grants are a little bit confusing. And so I was like, hey, is it okay if we have a follow-up conversation about the grant? Maybe, I can have coffee later next week so I can just have some, after processing
Mm-hmm.
this meeting, I have some poignant questions. Well, she was like, I'm happy to meet with you further, but I think we need to talk about how God is calling you to come to Virginia Theological Seminary as someone who's a lay leader. So I'd really like
Yeah.
to talk to you about that. And I remember being like, that never came up in the
Yeah.
conversation. And so
Yeah.
I just felt like God hit me over the head with it. And it was 30 days from term start at that point. And
Wow.
I said, okay, let's talk about it. So I met with her, and it just, God's voice could not be clearer that I needed to go to this school to like
Nice.
learn more about theology, to get the language that I was already talking about, but didn't have the terminology or the theologians to really understand a more complex nuance of it. And I applied 22 days before this term start and was accepted and hit the ground running. And so
Mm-hmm.
VTS was another one of those. God's voice was very clear using people around me. Really grateful for Dr. Lisa Kimball. I think she has a unique ability to discern things like that and invite people into deeper conversations. And as a result, I have really witnessed both my faith deeply grow at VTS, but also my ability to lead and have the terminology needed to navigate conversation. So similarly to how Tina provided that for me of when I started combating domestic sex trafficking, VTS has provided me all the cultural liturgies, actual liturgies, terminologies, theologians. So I am able to enter rooms and have a much higher level conversation.
Okay.
And lead people in that way.
Nice, nice. So here we are. We've and the kind of our last segment here is you have this unique experience of sex trafficking, combating sex trafficking, and also a deep involvement and a growing involvement with the church. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind reflecting for a few minutes on, what in church we'll put it as a capital C church, not necessarily picking on the Episcopal Church, though we can, and critique the Episcopal Church's response in this area. But what would you say? Would you want to say to church leaders about things like the current involvement with Epstein and files and those kind of things? I mean, what do you think? Where do you think the church should make its put its moral standard out there to say, hey, this is what's right and this is what's wrong?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. And I think it actually harkens back to like earlier experience. I think as a church, we struggle with sexual ethic. as a whole, talking about sex or anything that has to do with sex, even if it is in the lens of abuse and sex crimes, we struggle to navigate how do we theologically faithfully respond. I think that is intertwined to just trying to develop our own sexual ethics within a church and congregation that is honoring consent and agency. And I think first and foremost, I would say do that work. Like, understand where you are coming from as a congregation so that you have language when things like the Epstein files happen. You have language within your congregation to be like, this goes against our theology and our sexual ethic as a congregation, as a big capital C church, or as an Episcopal church, that you're able to have that stance. Similarly to how we've done the work of racial justice and understanding where our line stands there, where our boundaries are, how we can combat it and say that like racism is wrong and that we have work to do in our complicity within that system. We have to do that same work in sexual abuse and trafficking. There is complicity that we all have within a poor sexual ethic that has given into this system that perpetuates this system. And we also need to theologically understand where we're coming from. Similarly, how we theologically take a stance against racism through a racial justice lens. We need to take a stance against sexual abuse and sexual violence of all kinds. And I think we do a little bit within, at least the Episcopal Church, within Safe Church. We honor that it happens and that we want to create spaces that are safe and educated around those issues. But I think there's more work to be done in the system level. I think a lot of times it's really easy to say, this doesn't apply to me. Like this isn't impacting our congregations. Nobody here is experiencing that. But that's really not true. Like, first of all, statistically, someone is experiencing that within your congregation, unfortunately, with how rampant sexual abuse and sex trafficking and sexual assault and rape are. Like, someone has experienced it in your congregation or is currently experiencing it. So it's not something that you can say this doesn't apply to us. So I want to just take that myth off the table. It does. And as spiritual leaders, we need to understand that that is happening within our spaces. And when you have something that is going on the world stage, not even like the national stage, but the world stage, where survivors of horrific abuse are coming up against really powerful men, I mean, sometimes women, but mostly men, and saying like, we want justice, and they're not receiving justice, right, or justice is taking a long time and longer than makes us comfortable. If you have been a victim of any form of abuse and you're watching that on the world stage, that can be incredibly triggering. And so I'm watching this pastoral care crisis where people are not articulating like why they're in so much pain or anger, because they're not always recognizing or have the language that they're watching on the world stage happen to really important people and that could have happened to them on a much smaller stage, like a state level or a local level, where they didn't get justice, or justice came really slowly, or it was inequitable, or they never reported because they were really afraid that they would be victimized versus, taken seriously. They're watching that conversation happen with world leaders. That is so incredibly potentially triggering. And so it's absolutely happening in our congregation. Even if someone is not currently being trafficked, watching the Epstein files happen on this world stage could be causing a pastoral care crisis within your congregation, on feeling triggered by it, feeling re-traumatized. I mean, as an abuse survivor myself, watching this happen has been re-traumatizing for me. And I've had to do a lot of work to make sure that I am safe within that conversation, as everybody who's abuse survivors have to do. And I have all those tools. I have therapists. I have already worked through a lot of that. And I have the articulation of what's happening, so I can go get the help. Not everyone in your congregation has those resources or tools, especially for smaller churches that may be in rural areas that have one social worker or one counselor, right? And so I think the church needs to understand this is happening, and it's happening within their congregants, or has happened to their congregants on whatever level. B, I think they need to understand the pastoral crisis that is happening, that people may not have the tools or resources to articulate why they're in pastoral crisis. And I think we need to step into the breach and provide those tools and resources and have a conversation that names and rebukes evil, because that is absolutely scripturally and doctrinally in most churches, but especially in the Episcopal Church, grounded in our theology and doctrine. So we need to say, this is evil, what has happened to these victims. We need to rebuke it. Similarly, how we've rebuked other things that are happening currently within our nation, and naming those wrongs. And then we need to invite people into a place of safety where they can lament, where they can get resources that they need, and where that we are getting education around issues as well. Similar to how we all started in the Episcopal Church, at least, especially in Northern Virginia, DC, and Maryland, really committed to getting immigration education and understanding what's happening in our country through that. This is a time to re-invite ourselves into the conversation of what is sex trafficking or sexual assault or sexual abuse or rape? What is happening in our country today? Give me more education on it beyond just like the beautiful job Safe Church does. There's always more conversation to have. So find your local organizations that are survivor and trauma informed, get educated about the issue in your area, because you don't know if there's a track even right next to your church, right? Like that's happening, or somebody is a buyer in your congregation, right? Like how do you navigate that? Or someone's a victim, but now like maybe they're in a safe place and they're able to come. I also know of survivors who I've worked with before in the past who were allowed to go to church during when they were being trafficked, right? So like, how do you recognize that within your congregation? So learning and equipping ourselves with those tools so that we can pastorally enter the conversation, so we can enter the conversation with seeking real justice and action, and so that we can enter the conversation for safety within our own congregations and understanding what's happening in our environments around us. So I'd love to see that begin in the church. I'd love to see this be a spark that starts a fire under both the Episcopal Church and the capital C Church that says, okay, there's more work to be done. We need to learn more, we need to love more, and we need to really rebuke and condemn the evil actions of things like the Epstein files.
Right. Good. Oh, thank you. And I guess I wonder aloud about, given the history, the mid 20th century history and forward of almost every church. I mean, it is every church, but depending on how it's been kind of publicized or handled, that there's been sexual trauma enacted by church leaders upon young or older church members, right? We have the clergy sexual abuses, and don't need to name the denomination because it's every denomination has gone through it. The Episcopal Church went through it, in the 80s and early 90s of pulling, kind of outing and confronting those sexual predators in the leadership mix, and so I wonder if some of the clergy, some of the priests in the church and leaders in the church and deacons are hesitant to get anywhere near this conversation of sexuality because it can so easily or has so easily fallen into things like purity culture, that it's been taken to these extremes of saying, well, the best way to handle sex is just to say it shouldn't happen. And so, and if we can just kind of put that moral lid on it, then therefore we've done our job. And what I'm hearing you saying is, no, that's not an adequate response, that it has to be something else. Is that your feeling? And what do you think about that?
Yeah. And I also would say the beauty of this is we're not alone, that there are deeply brilliant theologians doing this work. Like there are trauma-informed, survivor-informed, liberative theologians doing this work. And there's also theologians working on how do you talk about sexual ethics within a parish and congregations. I think it's Shauna Copeland who really talks about how like a good sexual ethics is oriented towards justice, right? And so that's beyond a like, just don't do it. Or we're going to talk about, you do it, but we're not going to talk about it. Or we're just not going to talk about it, which are like kind of the three ways I feel like are interacted the most. Or we'll talk about it in certain lens, but we're certainly not going to talk about it in another lens. If you're looking at how are we creating a sexual ethic, both like, I would also encourage people to do this in their homes, right? How are we creating a sexual ethics that's geared towards justice? Because gearing towards justice means there's agency, there's consent, there's inclusivity, there's understanding of complicity of power dynamics. And so how are we doing that work as, a parish, right? Like how are we doing that work as a diocese, as a national church? All of that is really important, especially within the conversation where you're integrating into trying to rebuke sexual violence and sexual assault and rape and sex trafficking, like understanding that we are not alone. I mean, thanks be to God that we're not alone and that there are deep theologians already doing a lot of this work, both through a biblical lens, but a doctoral lens and in companion with one another that are giving us questions that we can do. Also, like you said, there's complicity in the church, right? And, if you think of the time where that was really being a struggle in the Episcopal Church and the times where Epstein was really flourishing, they're very similar times. And so there's some complicity conversations we should be having and navigating. And it moves beyond just how do we make sure it never happens again, which is incredibly important. We need to continue to have safe church conversations. I am a huge proponent of safe church. And if you're not Episcopalian, that is the Episcopalian network that we require for anybody that is working with children, youth, vulnerable populations, or anyone in ministry leadership, whether vestry, clergy, lay vocational ministers, deacons, everyone that could be in a powerful position as a faith leader to understand their power dynamics and to create safe church communities. And so we need to keep doing that, and we need to keep doing that work. But we also need to talk about at the same time, like what our theology is around, when something happens. I tell people all the time that if you don't hear that something happens in a place, that doesn't mean it doesn't. It just means there's not always things in place to protect people so it doesn't happen. So, for example, when families are looking for colleges to send their children to, when they come back and say that, oh, well, the college doesn't post rape statistics, I'm like, oh, don't go there. Because it's not that rape isn't happening on campus, it's that they don't want to publish it, which means there's not procedures and boundaries and things in place because they're more afraid of this old idea, which I think is a really early 2000s, mid 2000s, and definitely before idea that if we talk about it, people won't like us. If we're transparent that something happens here, people are likely to not come to us. That's not true. Transparency is what kills evil. And so, like, if there's no college campus in the world where a rape has not happened, so as a result, having boundaries and statistics in place demonstrates that you take it seriously, or at least starting to take it seriously, because you have data that you can use to ensure that there is less and less happening on your campus. Similarly to a church, we can't just hide behind nothing ever happens to our congregants, nothing ever happens here. What really works as a transparency is we understand that abuse has happened in both our, like, not maybe their church, but like in the capital C church or the Episcopal denomination. We understand that it happens in our world and that our parishioners have faced potentially abuse. And we're going to make sure that we talk about it in a trauma-informed lens that's safe, that I wish that all priests and all faith leader got trauma-informed education of how to receive somebody telling you that they've been abused, because majority of the time it's a teacher or a trusted faith leader of all types of religions that are going to hear somebody report and say, this has happened to me. And very few places give any faith leaders training around that from like a seminary level or an academic level. And I think that's a disservice too. I'd love to see the church move into making sure that faith leaders got that form of training. Like, what do you do if somebody comes to you and say, I'm being trafficked? Like, how do you
Yeah.
respond?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that response is usually very indicative of the care they get going forward. And so, how do we respond so that we're not integrating shame, that we're not integrating our own emotions, or we're not getting vicariously traumatized when somebody is telling us of their own trauma? How do we take care of ourselves after somebody has told us that something has happened to them? Like, these are all tools that you learn if you work in nonprofit agencies where you're working with survivors, but not necessarily that you would learn in the church. And I think that also that does a disservice to all priests and faith leaders out there. It doesn't protect you spiritually, emotionally, and it also doesn't provide you with the resources you need to be a good pastoral care.
Well, Lauren, thank you for such a courageous conversation, and I'm so happy that we've been able to have this time together.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Wow, spectacular. Well done. And thank you really for your work and all the work you're doing, both of you, sharing this, how to help people protect themselves and each other. So thank you all. Thank you to our readers, our listeners, our viewers for listening to this month's episode of Courage to Thrive, starring Reverend Bob Flanagan. I'm Hope Katz-Gibbs, thrilled to be here to bring you such important conversations. We'll see you all next time.